Welcome, dear learners. You are joining me in the second session, which is going to talk again about the development of radio. And in this session, we are going to focus on how radio has developed after independence, the post colonial period, the recommendations of this very important Varghese Committee, the time of free airwaves, Prasar Bharati, and the journey of radio till date as we know it. So, let us begin. When we talk about radio after independence, when the British left India, India was left as a poor and a divided country. Thus, India was left only with 6 stations at Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, Lucknow, and Tiruchirappalli, with 18 transmitters, 6 on the medium width and the rest on small width. The coverage area was 2.5% and 11% of the population, and the radio listening on MW was confined only to urban areas. Role of communication for national development was underscored in India even prior to her independence. So it took our country some time to realize how communication can actually help in bring about development and how radio can become a very potent vehicle for bringing about development. Now, the Indian National Congress, while formulating policies for the national development of independent India, set up a subcommittee on communication under the National Planning Committee to offer recommendations for development of communication for independent India. The report of the National Planning Committee cited the following as the target of broadcasting for independent India. Now, what were these things that they cited? They talked about dissemination of news and useful information. They talked about adult education and fighting the ignorance which was prevalent in the rural areas, the propaganda by the state, and entertainment in NPC Section 13. After independence in 1947, the new Indian government announced a development oriented agenda of governance which was delegated specially for the amelioration of the economic, educational, and health conditions of the people. Targeting the development communication, the new government adopted the recommendations of the National Planning Committee as the mainstay of its communication policies. Now, there is a very important P.C. Joshi report in this context, and in his book on communication and national development, Joshi wrote that the issue of using modern communication acquired high priority as the developmental resource during the Nehruvian era when the planners explored the prospects of using radio as a tool and agent of development, that is, for information and for enlightening the people in the countryside, in rural areas, in towns on developmental issues. Post-independence growth plan was charted by drafting the Bombay Plan, which is also called the Plan A for economic development of India. It was drafted by J.R.D. Tata and G.D. Birla and was extensively discussed in the Birla-owned journal which was called the Eastern Economist. This plan had supported private enterprise as well as the protectionist policies in support of indigenous capital. However, the state remained the nodal agency in the area of economic growth. In 1955, the Industrial Policy Statement was adopted. In this policy, the basic and strategic industries, including heavy industrial plants, etc., were all reserved for development in public sector. Similarly, in the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, telecommunication, broadcasting, and defense equipment was also reserved for the public sector. Now let us talk about the post-colonial period. In the first five-year plan in India, no financial allotment was done for the broadcasting sector, but investment to the tune of 4.94 crores was done by 1956, and most of the region was covered by All India Radio. The second five-year plan envisaged wider coverage, and for the first time, plan document spoke about setting up a TV station with an allocation of 40 lakhs. Now, on the entire plan allocation of 9 crores, The maximum amount, that is 267.81 lakhs, was earmarked for studio installation and additional office accommodation. Hence, the focus was on infrastructure development, and this trend continued. However, the growth had not been as fast. By 1960, 56% of the population and 37% of the country's area was covered by medium wave services. Therefore, the majority of the area was left to short wave coverage only. During that time, the system of collecting license fees was also in force. So, a person with a radio set was required to deposit a fee amounting to the local post office to ensure continuing reception of signals, like we do now for the digital TV setup or the set-top boxes. And it is still in vogue in UK as far as the BBC is concerned. BBC has been able to retain its autonomy largely because of the license fees that it charges, which it collects, and they do not depend on the government for any kind of fund in order to sustain themselves. This system of collecting license fees was eventually abolished in 1970s. During that time, after 1968, the annual rate of increase in licenses has fallen steadily, and the number of households with radio sets were only about 25 million. Even production of sets have witnessed a slow decline. Radio sets were more in demand then, and it could be supplied more in the period of 1960 to 1970, but the demand started declining after that. And this was also the time when Green Revolution came to India, and it was in full swing, and AIR had been a close companion of the revolution. It was naturally expected that the demand will increase for the sets. So this is how radio was developing after independence in India. But the expectations were different, and what we were met with was different. In spite of the slowdown in the listeners' base, the setting up of stations and the transmitters went on. And most of the transmitters were set up as a part of political necessities also. In 1962, India fought a war with China in the northeastern front, and this war revealed the inadequacy of the reception of radio signals in the border areas. And as a follow-up of this, the government constituted a committee on broadcasting and information media, and this was popularly known as the Chanda Committee, and it was constituted on 14th December 1964. The committee reviewed the operation of various media units under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and it submitted a report on the radio and television on 18th April 1966. Now, this report said that the committee felt that it was not possible in the Indian context for a creative medium like broadcasting to flourish under the regimentation of departmental rules and regulations. Therefore, it recommended that the constitution of a separate corporation for radio and television be formed. The report also suggested that both of them be given freedom in order to evolve their own recruitment rules, the pay scales and service conditions according to their varied and peculiar necessities. Another recommendation was for starting of a commercial service, and it was started from Vividh Bharati in 1967. In April 1970, the Lok Sabha was informed by the government that it was not the opportune time to consider the conversion of All India Radio into an autonomous corporation. But a major structural change was accepted, that is, a separate radio and television stations. Doordarshan came into existence on April 1, 1976, under the Ministry of INB. Soon after the internal emergency, a white paper on the misuse of mass media during the emergency was presented in the Parliament in 1977 August. In the elections, the opposition parties presented freedom of expression, including autonomy, to electronic media as a major election plank. After the new Janata Party government took charge, the working group on autonomy of AIR and DD was constituted by the Ministry of INB by a Gazette notification on 17th of August 1977 under the chairmanship of B.G. Varghese with 11 members. Now, there were some basic and very relevant major recommendations that the Varghese Committee gave. A few of them I would discuss with you. It talked about and stressed upon setting up of an independent public corporation acting impartially as trustee in the public interest, referred to as Akash Bharti in the tune of National Broadcasting Trust. The committee did not want two separate corporations for Akashvani and Doordarshan, but suggested a highly decentralized four-tier broadcasting organization at central, zonal, regional, and local levels. India also hosted the Asian Games in 1982, and the television, which was still at a nascent stage then, received a major boost due to this. In 1984, Rajiv Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India, and he was very keen on bringing in the medium. The entire political focus shifted to the new medium of those times, the television. The popularity of AIR also declined, and there was general apathy in the government to rejuvenate the medium. Now came the time of free airwaves. The 1990s was a very crucial period for India, both politically and economically. India was suffering from internal political instability, and the fragile National Front coalition faced a nationwide crisis in the summer of 1990 over its affirmative action policies. By autumn, a campaign by the BJP to build a Hindu temple at the site of 16th Mosque in Ayodhya resulted in a widespread communal violence. The government collapsed when the BJP pulled out. A new minority government failed to pass the scheduled budget in February 1991 when it lost the Congress Party's external support. In May 1991, while campaigning for the general elections, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. In reaction and in parallel to these developments, the economic situation worsened. By September 1990, net inflows of NRIs, the non-resident Indians, deposits had turned negative. Access to commercial borrowing had become more costly, and by December, even short-term credit was restricted. The foreign exchange reserves also fell, and they fell to 1.2 billion in January 1991. By the time a new government took over in June, reserves could cover only 2 weeks of imports. India was close to defaulting on its sovereign debt for the first time in its history. Thus, India negotiated a $1.8 billion loan from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, with certain conditions. The condition applied by IMF resulted in the Structural Adjustment Program, which is also called the SAP, which preempted the involvement of the state in state expenditures and in many welfare sectors, including health and education. Neoliberalism had entered India with full force. Now came the time of Prasar Bharati. Prasar Bharati Broadcasting Corporation of India, which was the BCI Act, had enacted with the objective to confer autonomy on Akashvani as well as Doordarshan, thereby ensuring that they function in a fair, objective, and creative manner. The Prasar Bharati Act provided a direction and a pointer, which should govern the broadcasting policies. The demand for autonomy by AIR as well as Doordarshan dates back to the mid-60s, when the first ever expert committee, famously known as the Chanda Committee, went into the issue. The Prasar Bharati Bill of 1989 is largely based on the Verghese report, which came out in 1978, and the Prasar Bharati Bill of 1979 that was introduced by the Janta regime in Parliament in May 1979. The Prasar Bharati Bill favored the creation of a broadcasting corporation through an act of parliament. But the Verghese report clearly wanted broadcasting autonomy to be a part of Indian constitution. This would be necessary to ensure that no future government would tamper with the freedom and independence of the corporation. The bill managed to sneak in a representative of MIB as a part-time governor. This was not the full autonomy that the Verghese Committee was talking about in its report. The Bill of 1979 became an act in 1990 with the approval of all political parties in the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. The first step in the ruling Congress government took in response to the invasion by cross-border satellite television was to set up the Vardham Committee in 1991. This was basically done to re-examine the Prasar Bharati Act of 1990. The Ram Vilas Paswan Committee was set up for this purpose in 1995, and it submitted a 104 pages report, which was more of a working paper with 46 recommendations on public and private electronic media, newspapers, news agencies, and films. The committee had hammered out consensus on a national media policy. Some of the recommendations were incorporated in the Broadcasting Bill, which was introduced in the Parliament in May 1997. The Nitish Sen Gupta Committee of 1996 was constituted to have another look at the Prasar Bharati Act as well as to suggest more amendments. It submitted its report in August of the same year. And the government have never been serious about giving autonomy to the official electronic media, and so this bill remains some dead matter. This also was the time when the Supreme Court of India gave a ruling declaring airwaves as public property, and it came out in the year 1995. This translated into the radio sector being opened up to private players. Now, a handful of big business houses with non-media and media interests have dominated the FM radio market in India. The then Finance Minister P. Chidambaram had announced the licensing of 295 more radio stations in around 2013 and 14. Private FM channels are mainly urban-centric and they play 24/7 film songs. News is not allowed to be broadcast yet. Another offshoot of this was the community radio. Several non-governmental organizations and media activist groups campaigned for nearly a decade for the right to set up local radio stations and broadcasting facilities to support their community development work. They also networked to further the cause of community radio in the country. This network, soon after the announcement of the community radio policy, came together in January 2007 to constitute the Community Radio Forum, popularly known as CRF of India. CRF has support and promotes the setting up of community radio stations in India, and it lobbies for political changes that would amplify the progressive nature of the community radio policy and further simplify and democratize the licensing procedures. The Bangalore-based communication campaign group, also called Voices, convened a gathering of radio broadcasters, policy planners, media professionals, and not-for-profit associations in September 1996 to study how community radio could be relevant to India and to deliberate on policies appropriate for such an action. A declaration for establishment of community broadcasting was signed. A suggestion that AIR's local stations should allocate regular airtime for community broadcasting was also put forward. Requests were made for grant of licenses to NGOs and other non-profit making groups for running community radio stations across the country. Subsequently, UNESCO made available a portable production and transmission briefcase radio station, which was a kit to voices to do experimental broadcasts of programs for a hands-on learning experience towards the objective of setting up an independently run community radio station. These intense advocacy efforts about community radio broadcasting for the social sector finally catapulted into an inclusive community radio policy which was approved by the Union Cabinet in November 2006. As of 2012, there were 125 functioning community radio stations in the country. Of these 125 stations, more than 90 were campus radio stations located either in the campus of Educational Institute or Krishi Vigyan Kendra. By the end of March 2018, there were 238 functioning community radio stations in the country. Out of these, 135 were campus radio stations located in educational institutions, Krishi Vigyan Kendras, and state agricultural universities. Today, state's role has been diminished to being an enabler. Even the state media apparatuses and the Doordarshan and AIR have been formulating and following the revenue model of the private media houses in the country. With that, we come to the end of this session on development in radio, and I hope you found this session enjoyable and fruitful. Thank you all very much.